welcome everybody. First of all, I just want to say thanks to the Chicago Booth Alumni Club for sponsoring this event. The Alumni Club of Booth its purpose is to engage the community. We're trying hard to do that under these current circumstances. So we're glad that you're all on with us today. We also want to make it a bit interactive as much as we can. If you're on speaker view, you'll see Lyndon and I clear. You can change your view whichever way you want. I want to thank Nicole Yelsey and Joe Cortez for their leadership of the Booth Alumni Club. As Caroline said, we're going to go 45 minutes, so Lyndon and I chat a little bit, but we've already gotten a bunch of questions from the field, so we will make sure to try to get to as many of those as possible. So bear with us. This is the second in a series that we've done. The first was Finding Meaning in Your Career with Eric Weinheimer, and it's available to watch on video on the University of Chicago website. This one will be too. So I'm pleased to be here today with Lyndon Taylor. Let me tell you a little bit about him before we get started. Lyndon is the partner in charge of Heinrich & Struggle's Chicago office, and he leads the global diversity and inclusion practice across the executive search and consulting business. He's also a member of the CEO and board of directors of the financial services practices. And most of all, he's a 99 Booth alum and graduate of the full-time program. He sits on the boards of the Ann and Robert Lurie Children's Hospital, the Executive Leadership Council and Forums Committee of the Economic Club of Chicago. Before we get started, what we want to do in this series is respond directly to the unusual times that we're living in and how it's changed all our lives. We know throughout all our careers that we've been talking about diversity and inclusion, but the Black Lives Matter movement has really created an urgency that we've never seen before and that the world is responding to. It's created great opportunities. And nowhere do the ramifications of the Black Lives Matter movement play out more than in our workplace. For those of us who do recruitment, the thing that we're hearing from all our clients now is we're looking for diverse candidates. But we know that there's more to just putting a Band-Aid on the problem. And we know it's all about implementing long-term solutions. So Lyndon's career has focused on these issues. And so Lyndon, thank you so much for being with us today. I want to welcome you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Gail.
Great. Can you tell us just a little bit for background about your journey and how you came to this place?
Sure, Gail. Well, this place is 20 years ago. So if you go back, I've actually now focused, came into executive search with Heidrick about 20 years ago in a few months. But before joining Heidrick, I actually spent the earlier part of my career in banking and corporate finance. So started in traditional out of college investment banking analyst program, doing real estate investment banking at Merrill Lynch in New York. From there, I had the pleasure of being one of the first analysts to join, I guess, a company that is now infamous, Enron, during an exciting time of the company's journey. Spent years in corporate development in the US and Africa and other places. And actually then business school at Chicago, and after business school at Chicago, which was actually kind of formative for me. I had the chance to take a year-long economics development class from Marvin Zonas, and that prompted me to actually take some time off of my business and time in South Africa working on RDP program after apartheid ended, and then came back and finished up at Chicago. And after that, joined a firm called Dillon Read in Power Pipelines M&A, and Dillon Read was acquired by UBS and et cetera, and then recruited from UBS and by Heidrick into executive search. My wife likes to joke that, you know, none of the companies I worked for before coming into executive search exist anymore. in their form. So I'm not sure, or in the form in which I worked with them. So I'm not sure what that means. I've had a chance to work across a number of practices with the firm, with Heidrick, and spent 10 years with one of our competitors, and then returned to Heidrick. But throughout my career, I have focused on, why I like my role is proactively identifying underrepresented groups in my broader work and bringing them to the table for our clients, and helping them actually embed diversity across their executive teams and help create inclusive cultures. So I take joy in my work, as you talked about earlier. So happy to be here.
Great, and we're thrilled to have you. And when we close up offline, I want to talk about the fact that Marvin Zonis, who was my undergraduate advisor at the U of C, is the one who brought me to the business school. So we'll compare notes. Perfect. Thank Marvin for today's, for bringing us both here today. Great, so I want to start with a question that I alluded to in the introduction. When you have a client call you and say, find us a diverse candidate, we need a candidate of color, we need a Black candidate for this position, how do you answer that question?
I ask them why, quite frankly, because I think it's important that companies and organizations be strategic and not reactive. If you kind of look back and ask why, given the US and a number of companies has had a focus on diversity for some period of time, just let's say post the civil rights era, and why the needle has not moved or the gains have not been made, it's because companies and organizations often treat diversity as an initiative, right? And they haven't done the work of actually required to actually sustain it. So if you look at organizations that actually make progress in anything that they do, right? They define their goals, they develop a strategy, they develop a roadmap and the execution strategy to achieve it, right? And they measure the results over time, so they can adjust the strategy over time. And I would say that organizations that actually do well with actually advancing diversity do that, right? They define what they do. Three things, right? They define what diversity is for them and the organization. They communicate it, and they then link that to their talent and business strategies, and they measure impact over time, right? Such that they can adjust. And what does that mean? That means that any effort around diversity, right, needs to be, so if I'm going to speak in threes, it needs to be targeted, focused, and sustained, right? So the focus part is when they come to me and said, or the targeted part is when they come to me and said, recruit a diverse executive. Well, I'll ask them, how does this fit into your overall strategy and your impact? What is the team that person is going to join, right? What have you done to build an inclusive culture, right? And I think those things are important because that's what the executives are asking in the back of their mind. If you were to call me today and say, Lyndon, I'm going to look at that executive team at that organization. I'm going to think about them. I'm going to ask the key questions of what have they done to develop the talent in that organization. I want to think about how will I succeed in that organization? And what are the indicators of success for me there? So that's why it's important to do those things.
So when you have that culture, Lyndon, and how do you change the culture to reflect those goals?
Yeah, I think culture is intentional, right? Every day as we going back to that point, you get the culture you have, you get the culture you work on development. And one of the things that we do, and I think is important, is to think about culture even at the most micro level. Anybody who works with someone else is projecting a culture. Every leader is projecting a culture. We often say that a company, an organization's culture is driven by the board and the executive leadership team, the shadows that they cast. But I say it goes further than that. It goes down to throughout the organization. So why is that important? That's important to actually focus and work on developing inclusive leaders, right? Leaders that have the ability to lead diverse teams, right? So that's how you work on it. You work on it at the individual leader level of helping those leaders develop as leaders, right? A part of a broad leadership capabilities. I would argue you can't be a great leader if you don't have the ability to lead diverse and inclusive teams.
Are you there, Lyndon? I'm losing you.
I am here. I think we had
Okay.
a bit of background noise.
Okay, there we go. There. So we have an educated, smart group of people on with us today. Many of them schooled in at the U of C, and it's the 50th anniversary of Milton Friedman's article, and there's lots of talk in the press about shareholder value. And yet the New York Times came out today, and there was an article about Mark Benioff's efforts at Salesforce to really create stakeholder capitalism, to make it a broader conversation than just shareholder value. But even in a firm that made that an affirmative push, they can't measure the results. The results are really tough to measure about how the change in diversity and inclusion as one of the objectives has been impacted. So what does it mean in this world?
Yeah, I appreciate it. I think, as I alluded to, I haven't had a chance to read the New York Times article, but I'm aware of the broader move around organizations, even starting with the Business Roundtable last year, to say that, look, we have diverse stakeholders. I would say one thing, and I would agree, quite frankly, asked me about Mark Benioff. I would say it's a little new, right? So the research is still being done. From that perspective, how do you think broadly about stakeholders? But I think one thing that this moment, starting with COVID, of all of us being home now, welcoming each other into our living rooms, has illustrated, and you alluded to earlier, the movement around social justice. It has shown everyone that individuals can't separate who they are from where they work. So organizations that actually exceed and actually get the benefit, I hate to use the term leverage, but we're finance people sometimes, get the benefit of all of the talents of their organizations, recognize that, right? And they create cultures where their actually employees can actually thrive, can innovate, can contribute, can belong, is the thing we talked about. And if they do that, those organizations actually outperform other organizations over time. I think if you look at the question of Mark Benioff's leadership and just look at the performance of Salesforce stock, if you're, to your point, if we're talking about shareholders, right, the shareholders have benefited from that broad leadership and innovation and drive of those, not just Mark, but of the employees there, and even the efforts to create an inclusive organization where everyone can join. We did a study, since we're dealing in data, last year, independent study of 455 executives around the world at organizations that had $5 billion in revenue and above, right? And actually tested the theory. So to say, through a series of questions, for those executives, do they feel like their organizations actually define diversity, right? And it's, again, that was specific to the geographies in which they're in, but they were part of global companies, but do they define diversity? Do the organizations define diversity? If those organizations do they actually link it to the business? And do they measure impact on business over time? So the three things I talked about. And what we found is the organizations that actually did those things, right, that we call them the Vanguard group of companies, there were about 20%, 22% of the organizations that actually did those. And if you compare their, since we're finance people, their 5-year top line revenue growth, that though the 5-year top line revenue growth against that 22% versus a group that did not do those three things was 67% higher. Right. So again, when you start looking at impact over time, I would argue that's an example. But if you want to, again, talk about shareholders, that's an example of impact on shareholders.
So the three areas that you talked about, and that you also mentioned in your recent Wall Street Journal article, do the KPIs change with the organization, the key indicators that you're looking for? I mean, how do we measure in different organizations? Maybe you're a nonprofit, maybe you're an association. How do you talk about the different KPIs?
Yeah, good question, Gail. I think you hit it on the head. You're right. They have to change. That's the importance of defining it for the organization and developing a strategy for the organization. And then the measure of impact will be different, You're right. If you're a nonprofit, if you're an association, but I think what we're finding is you have to think about impact holistically, right? Going back to the idea of stakeholders, right? The organizations that actually I think are leading think of stakeholders broadly, right? Shareholders being one group, right? But what has been clear is that you also the stakeholders are your employees. The stakeholders are your clients. Everyone has a client. The stakeholders are the community in which your employees live and work, and the businesses operate. So if you start to think about holistically, how are we thinking about impact, right? And I would argue that's actually when actually things succeed, because you have a comprehensive, holistic approach, right? Again, not treating one specific area, or you have to, or thinking about an initiative. You have to think holistically about it. That's the opportunity to actually drive sustainable change.
Great. So I'm going to ask you a question that came from the comments that were submitted earlier. One person said, I work in a small organization. How should D&I impact me? How do you, if I'm a small shop, I've got under 10 people. How does it impact me?
Yeah, I would argue I guess I would ask the question, how does it impact? Everybody is impacted by the organization in which they work. Mm-hmm. Right? Everyone is impacted, and I'm not sure if the person who asked the question was the leader of the organization or not, but I would say if that person is the leader of the organization, it's important that they, as we said before, focus on being an inclusive leader, focus on modeling inclusive behaviors, being intentional about the team that they build, being in terms of making sure you have diverse and inclusive, diverse experiences and perspectives, so that whatever solution you're driving for, it is getting the best solution and you're managing risk in the most appropriate way.
Great, thank you. Another question that came from one of the participants was, how do you manage the resistance or frustration from the majority group?
No, yeah, I think, how do you do that? I think is about approaching it with curiosity. and recognizing and giving the benefit and giving grace to those who have questions or those who might be less comfortable than others. We have to recognize that everyone is at a different place in their journey. Just like when we talk about diversity, everyone has had different experiences and perspectives. And if you're really going to engage the broad group, you actually have to do that. You have to engage them in genuine dialogue and conversation. And you hate the term, but bring them along as best you can, right? And recognizing that there will be some people who will lean in, there will be some people who will be champions, and there'll be some others who will be just quiet supporters. And yes, there will be some resistors, but you have to recognize that you have to meet the group where they are and being willing to engage in very genuine dialogue and conversation.
Great, thanks. Another question is, I have an organization, they've begun implementing a true diversity program. Now, when we bring in candidates, as the question asks, how do we make sure that they're successful in their job? How do we help them to be, to succeed and hold them accountable as well?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. And I think this goes back to the earlier discussion around, you can't just think of one part of it. It has to be holistic. So oftentimes, like I'm in the executive search area, and while we do executive search, we also do advisory work with clients as well on, building organizational culture and developing leaders. And I think that latter piece, it is important to think about the team that the individual is going to join, right? Oftentimes we put the burden of being included on those who are joining versus the group that they're joining. So I think it's important to actually work with the group to say, what is our culture of this group? Let's be intentional and focus about how we have an onboarding process for this executive who's joining. How are we going to include them? What's the right onboarding plan, both that, initially 3-6 months, the right, systematized follow-up and feedback, and include them. And every feedback doesn't have to be about development. It is kind of be about what is the progress. And I think those are some steps that we found that organizations that do it well, not just focus on the recruitment, they focus on the onboarding and the culture of the team and understanding that.
Great. That's really helpful. I know that people are out there and they probably have questions. Caroline, if we can open the group up, can we allow some questions from the group?
Yeah, absolutely. There is one question in the chat. Actually, there are two. So one says, in the 1990s, I had the great fortune to work in a massively diverse team, both in makeup and thought, during the hyper-growth phase at BlackRock in NYC in the 1990s. Why are so many large organizations lacking diversity in thought in 2020, and how do we alter that?
Yeah, I think, good question. And I think one part of it is, David, is that focus on understanding the importance of different experiences and perspectives. What often happens as organizations grow over time is they get a playbook of, quote, who succeeds here? What is required to succeed here? And it oftentimes becomes those people who are defining that are defining it based on their own experiences and how they succeeded. And or how they developed, right? What we find is people tend to hire people who look and act like them. And I think that's then where you don't get that diversity of thought. So I think if you're intentional in the very beginning about saying, look, we want to specifically think about different profiles, different perspectives, different experiences, and we value that, right? To get better answers, better investment decisions, better risk management, that's important to do. But again, you have to be intentional about it.
Great. The video is on.
Reginald, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Lyndon, I'm very interested in what do you see as the biggest barrier to becoming a more inclusive D&I organization? We see a lot of companies make statements, a lot of companies say what you just said in terms of they're intentional, they make plans, they do all the stuff that you just talked about, but it seems that they're still trying to figure out how to make that actually happen. So what do you see as that barrier?
Yeah, I think you hit at it, Reginald. Part of it. Two things I would say is one is they make statements, they actually don't make plans. So, right, they make statements without plans, and I'm sorry, the organization. So that becomes a bigger barrier. Again, you have to actually have a plan and a strategy that is comprehensive. You then actually have to help, actually measure results. And when I say measure results, you're actually then holding someone accountable, right? You're holding individuals at different levels of the organization accountable for those things, and by the, accountable for making progress over time, and you report on it. I think that's one of the things that I think they don't do, and that's been part of the challenge. They also, quite frankly, bifurcate their efforts, right? They focus it at the board level or focus at the executive level and don't think about the mid and lower levels of recruitment, or if they focus on the mid and lower level of recruitments, they don't do the latter, the former, of actually focus on the board. And then they only focus on recruitment and don't focus on developing the talent that they have, right? To say recruitment, and while Gail and I are both in the executive search business, and we love to have clients come and help us find more talent, you will not actually move the needle in sustaining the efforts and make progress on diversity doing that alone. You actually have to, as someone talked about earlier, focus on building a culture of inclusion and developing the leaders within the organization that you have and giving them pathways for success. So you have to do it all.
Great. I'm going to ask a question that came in through the chat, and there's a couple of them. We'll try to get to all of them, but I think this is really great. Is this a moment or is this a movement? Gian Foreman asks, and if moment in time, and Gian, if you're out there, nice to see you, how do we ensure that the moment is as big as possible to ensure that it has long-lasting impact?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and someone asked me that. I think it is a moment that I'm actually determined to turn into a movement. I think others are as well. How do you do that? I think by holding accountable. I mean, with someone earlier, I think Reginald said, there have been a number of organizations who have made a number of statements around what they're going to do and how they're going to impact their community. And I think it's incumbent of all their stakeholders to actually hold them accountable. One thing that's different, and we kind of observed this, and I'm not sure about the demographic makeup of this group here. But why I think it is different is that we have heard from a number of our clients that their employee base is engaged in actually holding them accountable. Their employee base is looking up and saying, how does our organization, how do I know that this is an organization where I can succeed? And I'm looking at, my leaders, my managers, my board, right, to actually demonstrate that. So I think the opportunity to turn a movement into a moment into a movement, rather, is that actually all of the people we talked about, the shareholders, the employees, the community, the clients, actually to hold people that are making statements accountable, and to actually go back and say, you said you were going to do this, what have you done? What has changed?
Right. Concepcion Prado has asked, one challenge to firms is keeping diverse talent. Diverse talent sometimes faces microaggression and exclusion. They leave their companies more often. How do you manage the inclusionary process to keep them on board?
Yeah, I mean, some of it become, Mike, I don't want to be repetitive, but I think you have to manage the development of your leaders. I think it's important that oftentimes when organizations invest, many organizations invest in, quote, management and leadership development. Mm-hmm. Right? And what oftentimes we ask people to lead and to manage, diverse and otherwise, right? And they haven't been trained how to be leaders. They haven't been, they haven't learned, right? They haven't how to lead and manage. And if they have, there hasn't been investment in helping them learn how to manage and lead diverse teams, right? Again, when we're going back there, there are some times when someone's never managed a woman. They're a group they've never managed, they've never interacted with. So if you're someone or managed a person of color, and sometimes they are less comfortable, so you have to invest in their development. You then have to actually go back and be intentional about looking at seeing how they brought people through. Right? I think every manager, I saw a question about KPIs, is I think every manager should be evaluated on how have they recruited, developed, and promoted their team. And if you look at it, said someone who's never, recruited, developed, or promoted a person of color or a woman, and that is represented in the organization, I think that's something that should be investigated and challenged, reviewed.
And thank you for underlining the fact that diversity means a lot of different things. When I was in Seattle and I attended diversity training in the tech companies, oftentimes that might have meant bringing a woman in. So I know that diversity and it has many different flavors to it, and I want to make sure that all of what you're saying is applicable to that. And thank you for underlining it. Another question we received is, how do you implement a diverse program when you have overseas operations?
Yeah, I mean, look, often, there are a number of very global organizations who have strong, commitments to diversity. And I think part of it, they define it by their geographies, right, in which they work. I mean, to your point, the definition of what's important and what you're trying to achieve will vary based on the representative population and the countries and geographies in which the organization is operating, right? But what we are finding is increasingly global organizations are focusing on how are they developing global talent, right? And how are they then thinking about talent that can move around, but at the same time, balancing that with developing the talent and having a diversity strategy that is specific to that region, right, or to that country in which they operate. I think both are important.
Great. Caroline, do we have other questions from the video? I've been reading some of them, so I want to give people a chance to ask.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, there we go. I think that she who just turned on her video has a question. I don't know your name, I apologize.
Oh, no worries. Hi, it's Diane. Thanks for the presentation. It's really good. Our industry is not very diverse at all. And, when I kind of ask a question around, well, we need more diversity at senior leaders, the response back is, well, we don't have any turnover at that level, so are we supposed to force turnover? So I guess how to respond to that, as well as there's not very many people kind of in the pipeline that are diverse, and how do you kind of manage that with the fact that the day-to-day is really a lot about the numbers? Yeah, hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, no, I think there are a couple of questions there. So from that perspective, and I think the comment that our industry is not very diverse is something that we hear from a lot of organizations, right? I actually spend most of my time in financial services, which the sector which our space is not diverse. But I would say the importance of actually changing that over time is that the clients in which you serve, be it B2B or B2C or whatever, are diverse. And so it's important to understand those clients, understand those segments, which is why it's important to actually move to diversity over time. And I think oftentimes when clients tell me that, they say we're not, I ask them, what did you base that on? Right, so a lot of when they say we're not diverse, have you actually done the work of benchmarking where you are and benchmarking where you are against best in class or best in, from whatever perspective in your sector or in your space? So I think it's important to actually, so we're talking about living in the numbers, to understand the numbers, right? To say, if we think about across the levels of the organization, how do we look versus our sector, and how do we look versus, which we had some clients do the work, those who, if we're using the term diversity, would be considered, kind of the best in class, or those who are actually have made progress from that and actually have more diverse leadership teams. The other thing I think that you make progress from is that what we're finding from clients is the importance of having capabilities, right, and competencies that are transferable. So we would argue, when you think about assessing talent, that oftentimes, and Gail, feel free to jump in, I think you and I talked about this, that companies only focus on, and this goes back to the earlier question about, I think David had, is 25% of how they should be evaluating executives. And we find this even more important as you start to get to leadership. The pivotal, we would call it the pivotal experience and expertise, is only one part of how you think about it. Did this person code this, or can they code that, or did they do that or do that? As you get more and more up and down leadership, the broader things, the other three, 75% become important. And broadly speaking, one part of that is, what are the capabilities of a leader? What are their leadership capabilities, right? And there are a whole number of areas you start to look around leadership capabilities. I would argue inclusive leadership is only one, right? How do they develop and build people, right? How do they develop and build strategy? How do they come up with execute against that strategy? How do they react to changes in the market? Those are all things that are again, leadership capabilities. Then what's the agility and potential of the leaders that you're actually recruiting and bringing in, right? So focusing again on the competencies and characteristics to say, what do we need as an organization in the future? What's important for that? And are we building the team, and are we evaluating people against that, not now, right? So when you go to experience and expertise, that's the past. That's what somebody's done. Leadership capabilities are what they are currently doing, then focusing on their potential, and then also focusing on the impact that they have on culture, right? The ability to drive change, to move things forward. So you have to think holistically about it. And so what I would argue, what I'm saying is, shift the conversation. Once, the data and the numbers, and then shift the conversation to say, okay, are we actually thinking about talent the right way as we go out and identify and recruit and bring them in?
Awesome, thank you.
All right.
Great. Other questions from the group?
There is a question in the chat from Judith Myers that says, how can white/privileged leaders and change agents gain credibility and enlightenment to take this on and be responsible and accountable?
Yeah, this goes back to the earlier conversation around, I think everybody can. Just being, and I think it also goes to Guillaume's question earlier, because a lot of organizations have actually made these statements, and how do you sustain it? What I am encouraged by, that it is an opportunity for a movement at the moment, is you had, you name it, Fortune 100, 500 executive leader step out. And by the way, there are only 13, if you take the Fortune 100, 13 who are people of color of those CEOs. So most of those who are saying that are actually, quote, white privileged male leaders, right? Who are saying this is.
How many are women in that group as well?
Good coin. I think, I don't have the stat, but I think it's probably 13. So it's probably or less. um, to say, hey, to say this is important for us. This is why. And I think it's an opportunity for them to lead genuinely, right? So how do you do it? It's we talked about it earlier. It's going to be different for everyone. Every company's at a different place in the journey. Different people at a different place in the journey. They have different leadership styles. They have different things that they're comfortable with. So I think it's important for one. This is a step to recognize that it's important to lead. If you're a leader, to recognize it's important to lead, and to be willing to be vulnerable and recognize that. And it's important for those of us who are asking them to be accountable and asking them to lead, to provide grace for those who do, who are willing to step out and be vulnerable.
Great. David asks, and this is really pertinent, how has COVID impacted organizations' initiatives in this area?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would say it's made it more intentional. So when we, I would argue that in the age of COVID, it becomes increasing. It's made it more intentional around culture, is what I'd say. In the age of COVID, as more people, as everyone, right, is somewhere else than they normally are, usually, and engaged in a different way, we have found that companies have been more intentional and thoughtful about how do they engage their employees collectively and in a way that actually is inclusive, recognizing that there is no barrier now between home and work, and going back to and recognizing, as we just said earlier, what that has created is I would argue a little bit of genuineness, an opportunity to be more genuine in terms of the engagement, right? If you recognize that, if the leaders recognize that. I would argue, again, you have to be intentional about, if you're on the Zoom, like when I'm on my team, thinking about, okay, was everybody heard? Did we give everybody an opportunity to speak? And we're finding that companies do that now from that perspective. But I think they recognize that you can't ask your employees to separate who they are from where they work, because you're not asking them to do it. They're working from home.
Right, right. And is there an opportunity to really change culture when we're working remotely?
We're finding out, yes. All of this is a grand experiment, but I would say there is there is an opportunity, because if you can become intentional about it, right? If you can, if you can start to say, it requires work, right? But there are opportunities to actually engage in, one-on-one and broader groups, because technology allows you to do it.
Right.
It doesn't replace, we'll to be seeing that one-on-one, in-person engagement and genuine conversation. But yeah. I think yes.
We have time for one more question from the group, if we could get a live question. And I know some people were waiting. Let's see if they can weigh in. It takes a minute. There's a lag.
No worries.
I have a question that might spark something. Will organizations try to return to the old culture after COVID, if it ever happens? Or what do we need to be comfortable with, not just the new normal, but the new cultural normal? How do we plan and be intentional about that?
A good question. I'm not sure. I think that is the danger that they will. If I'm encouraged, to your point of being planned and intentional, is this relates to the earlier question, Gail, can you actually drive change? What we are seeing, at least in our advisory work, a number of clients proactively thinking about their employee base in those different segments and driving, I've used the term initiatives, but actually setting up sessions to actually engage those specific groups, all of the groups that they have, right? In terms of, if you think about the virtual town hall, have we actually engaged with diverse groups of our organization and heard them to actually hear what's important to them, what is bothering them, and actually then, to some extent, technology allows you to engage a broad group in virtual genuine conversations, right? And then actually to develop strategies to address concerns and questions and those kind of things. And I think if when we return to work, the question is the shift will be, those employees have now said, look, I expect to be heard and engaged. And it will be important to actually find ways to maintain the voice and maintain hearing from the broad group of employees. Because now, actually, I think some organizations have actually moved forward with creating culture of inclusion, and they have to think about how they adapt that once everybody returns.
Absolutely.
Danger, yes.
Absolutely. So Lyndon, as we head into the last minute or so here, is there anything I haven't asked you, or any theme that we should really reiterate and make sure that people leave with that in their thoughts?
Yeah, well, thank you. No, I think it's been an engaging, comprehensive conversation. I would say I will leave it with the three things I said before. I think as leaders in your own organizations, and think about how, committed to actually creating cultures of inclusion and advancing diversity. I think it goes back to what I said before. I think it's important for those organizations and those leaders to define diversity for them and why it's important to them. All right. And again, it's different. You use a Seattle, someone talked about geography, but having something that's specific and genuine to define, and then actually being able to articulate and link it to the talent and business strategy, and actually recognizing that it's required to be sustained over time and to actually commit to measuring impact over time. Those are the things important. Intentional, sustained.
Excellent. Lyndon, I so enjoyed our conversation. I thank you for joining us today. This will be recorded and will be available, and we'll send out a link for everyone. Thanks everyone for attending. I hope we see you live soon.
Thank you, Gail. It's a pleasure.
Okay.
The best.
Okay. Wishing you the best.